This is the most typical kind of attic you'll find in most houses in this whole country. It means that this space is not part of your heated space. It's a separate area, and really what you want to look for up here is insulation issues and air sealing issues. There's a lot of different types of insulation you might find up in the attic. This is the typical fiberglass bat. They come as it's usually faced, which means it's got this paper on it. That's the facing. And the facing should always face into the conditioned space. So if you're talking about an attic, it should face down. If you're talking about floors, it should face up. So this is fiberglass bat. Very typical. You'll find it in a lot of houses. Another kind you might find is blown cellulose or blown fiberglass. Both of them are similar. They're blown through a machine and they're much more fluffy. Fiberglass is a little bit usually whiter. It doesn't matter that much. The R value of all these different materials is close to the same. It's close to R 3.5 per inch. Other types you might find is rock wool and vermiculite. That becomes more and more rare. The most you're going to find is fiberglass bats, blown fiberglass, and blown cellulose. That's the most common. Now you see how this is here. I've seen this pretty often. It's not a bad idea. You're getting insulation over the hatch, but you're getting no air sealing at all. And there's a lot of air coming in through here. So if you look on my website, there's some great pictures of examples of hatches that people built here. Dams and hatches that are both air sealed and insulated. If you go for the proper amount of insulation, which is about 14, maybe 16 inches of blown fiberglass or blown cellulose, that is too high to have right by your hatch without it all falling in. That's why you need to build what we call a dam, which is basically just a wall of wood, probably, to make it strong, that's going to go all around this hole high enough so that your insulation won't be falling in. And you can have insulation right to the edge of it. Then you build an air-sealed hatch on top of that. Maybe hinged is the best kind, with insulation on the back so you can open it when you need to enter the attic. Here's another piece of insulation that really is not doing its job. It's just sitting there. It's not touching the drywall at all. So all this area and that section there that you can see is in the air, it's not doing anything. It's just taken up space, but it is not working as insulation. Remember, the R value of your insulation is what counts. What you're aiming for is probably an R49. It depends where you live, but R49 is typical for attics in almost all the country now. Even if you're in a hot place, the R49 helps keep the heat in the summer out of your house. Whereas in the north, you're more concerned with keeping the heat that you produce inside the house in the winter time. A house like this that has only an R13 with a lot of gaps, which probably effectively makes it probably only about an R8 or an R9 over the whole attic. If you brought that up to an R49, you should be able to save at least $50 a month, if not more, on your heating bills. If you do find a place where you can turn it over and look at the craft paper, it will have the R value printed on it. But what you can do easier than that is just take your measuring tape and measure the height of the insulation. I can't stress enough that you really need the insulation to be touching the pressure boundary. In this case, remember, up in the attic, the pressure boundary is your drywall ceiling. So what people do typically is just place it down. So here you just have the bat sitting on top of these wires. That means the bat's not touching the pressure boundary. That means air is passing under it, and it basically has no value at all. If you had blown insulation, not as much of an issue because it's blown insulation, it'll fill all the gaps. It's really an issue with bat, and it's very typical that the bat doesn't touch the pressure boundary and doesn't actually have nearly the value it should have. Looking at this attic with all the all the gaps it has and all the places where it's not touching the drywall. What's actually an old R19, so degraded, so even it's degraded, which means it's old, which means it's probably not an R19 anyways. But add to that all the places where there's gaps, all the places where it's not touching the drywall, and over this entire attic, you probably don't have more than maybe an R8 at best. So adding insulation here is going to be a very, very big benefit. Generally speaking, a 2.5% gap is a 10-fold decrease in your R value. So if you had just 2.5% of the entire area had gaps, that would reduce the R value by 25%. So if this was truly an R19, you'd really be talking about an R14, R15. That's huge difference for just 2.5% gap. A little bit. 2.5 square inches over 100 square inches of gap reduces your R value that much. It's very significant. Here again is a huge area that's not insulated, and it goes over into the soffit. So basically you're looking at where the roof overhangs the walls. And it looks to me like there's a very large gap there where not only this top ceiling is uninsulated, but the top of the walls are going to be uninsulated also. You will pay back your investment on the insulation within 2 or 3 years, and then you're just going to be saving. Now sometimes, especially if you have a blown material or a loose material like the vermiculite or like the blown cellulose or blown fiberglass, you can have what's called wind washing. Now wind washing is when the wind blows up through the soffits and the end there where there's usually a gap. The wind blows up and blows the cellulose or the fiberglass away. So you got areas where there's very little insulation and other areas where it's much higher. When you're measuring that, you need to average it out. If you do experience wind washing, one of the ways you can deal with that is using baffles. Baffles are very cheap. They're usually in these days foam pre-made boards that are kind of corrugated, and you're going to stick them up into this space here, but right in the corner. And the idea is partly to deflect the wind, but also partly so when you're blowing in new insulation, you can leave that area open. If you have soffit vents, you want that ventilation. You want that air to be passing through. It helps remove moisture from the attic. It helps remove heat from the attic. One other thing to consider when you're up in your attic is how much stuff do you have stored up there? What most people don't understand is that the value of insulation is in the air spaces within it. So if you have a nice big, say an R30 10-inch bat, and you put stored stuff on it and squished it down to that, you don't have an R30 anymore. That R30 is now, say, half that, an R10 or an R15. So if you do have stored goods up here, and bear in mind, if you're going to bring it up to R49, you're talking about an insulation level of about 14 inches. For sure, higher than your joists. Even if you have 2x10 joists, that's at least 4 inches higher than your joists. So consider that if you really want to have stored stuff up in your attic, you're losing insulation value, and that'll cost you. It's your choice. You may decide it's worth it to have that stuff up there, but understand that you're definitely losing value, and you could be insulating your attic much better if you're willing to take all the stored stuff out of it. One house I did an audit on a few years back, they had stored stuff throughout the whole attic. We talked them into taking all the stuff out. We gave them R49, nice thick insulation from an R13 that they had, and they saved almost $100 every month in the winter time.